Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Mihai Zodian, and today we will speak again about strategic studies. The topic of today's video is about Captain Mahan and sea power. One second, this is the outline. We will have an introduction, main arguments, case studies, definition, and several specific topics like Mahan and his definition of sea power and command of the sea, methodological critiques, and Mahan's view on US expansion at the end of the 19th century. Okay, Captain Mahan is basically the main thinker about sea power, and sea power defined as an autonomous form of an action as a decisive factor, and he lived in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. He was he served in the U.S. Navy. He was also a teacher, and during his time of teaching, he developed this strategy of sea power, who's derived from naval history. Now, this video is based on a course that I taught, seminar that I taught 2 years ago, and I thank Professor Radu Kukuta, who was the tutor, the main teacher, for allowing me to continue the seminar on YouTube. Now, why do we care about sea power? Let's look at news, because news show us whether sometimes show us whether a subject is relevant or not. So we have a news from yesterday that the US and Iran agreed to a 2 week ceasefire, and part of the ceasefire is about the Hormuz Strait. Hormuz Strait is an important naval communication line, important for the transport, the supply of oil. And so we see there a meaning of sea power, which is about provisions, resources, and so on. So in theory, if someone has sea power, someone can control shipping lanes, and it can influence like oil price and so on. Now the other news is about the Taiwan opposition leader who goes to China. Now Taiwan is an island, and the control of this island is a strategic point, may allow China to breach in let's let's say to have his her fleet more to offer her fleet more space to expand uh, in the end into the Pacific. So Taiwan is a key point in China's rise to become a world power in a military sense, and Taiwan is important at least as a neutral. They want, if China is able to achieve to make Taiwan at least neutral, so China tries to divide the Taiwan and invited the politician leader to China. So the control of this island is a strategic point. It's important for China. Okay, what are the main arguments? One is that Mahan has a major influence on modern naval policies. What I mean, we will see soon. There is here a quote about Mahan, who is the prophet of the sea power in the U.S. Navy. So Harry Stimson was like an American decision maker uh, in the War Department, Secretary of War. Well, during the World War II, and he argued that Mahan was so influential that his teaching were dogma, and he's very critical of that. So you see that Mahan was very influential 70 years ago, but you will see that Mahan is influential today too. Now, his main argument is that for a state to be a great power, that state needs to have this command of the sea. And this command of the sea allows a state to rule over the commerce. So he who commands the sea commands the commerce, and he who commands the commerce is the ruler, the main power. The third argument is that a fleet must be concentrated, which means you must gather all your might in one place, and it must be used to gain decisive victories. So you shouldn't spread the fleet. You should use it to battle the enemy fleet. And if you better destroy the enemy fleet, you kind of have a command of the sea. And if you have command of the sea, then you can impose a blockade and basically coerce the other states. This is in a nutshell Mahan. Now, there are several case studies. For Mahan, the main case studies was England, Great Britain, and this British Empire. It was the main historical materials from which he derived his theory. He derived his basic theory on the English war with France and with Dutch, Netherlands. Other examples are Germany in World War One. So Mahan was very influential in Germany. In Germany, when in the German Empire, Second German Empire, and his idea influenced, for example, the Weltpolitik, which was based on naval shipbuilding, on massive shipbuilding. So the German decision makers took Mahan's ideas about capital ships and so on, and made try to build a world fleet. This project led to an arms race with England, and this in the end led to World War One. So it's a major cause of World War One. So the influence of Mahan is not always good. Other examples are, it's of course the United States, as we saw, Mahan is the prophet and Neptune is the god. And there are at least two more. One is Japan and World War Two. So Japan is before and during World War II, tried to build a world-class navy, and that world-class navy was very Mahanite. So it relied on a doctrine of great battleships and tried to conquer sea lines. For example, in sea lines and also of resources like Indonesia, the current day Indonesia. And China today. China today is engaged in a massive shipbuilding program, like hundreds of ships, and it's basically following a Mahanite strategy. So it develops the economy, then it develops the world navy, comparable to the American one, not at the same level yet, but coming close. And somewhere in the future, it may achieve the status of not just an important economic and military power, but also a world power whose presence is felt everywhere. Now, today, the text of today, based on Philip A. Crowell, it's a chapter on Makers of Modern Strategy, the edition of 1986. Makers of Modern Strategy is basically an American handbook of strategy and military history, which has three editions. One is in 1943, the second one is in 1986, and there is a 2022, I think, new one. The best of them is the 1986 one, coordinated by, among others, Peter Parrott. And Philip Crowell was a teacher of U.S. Naval College, I think, and he wrote actually a very interesting and critical chapter about Mahan. Let's look at some concepts. Now, first of all, sea power actually can mean two things. Sea power can have a like a military meaning, like your fleet is the strongest, and you defeat all your enemies, so you kind of command the sea. And the other meaning is more economical. So you have not just the fleet, but the trade. You have also colonies, possessions, bases, and access to resources. Basically, the second meaning resembles a lot with Trump's declarative foreign policy, which is about possessions and resources and markets and so on. So basically, this policy is late 19th century. Another concept is lines of communication, which means like in Germany, it means supply lines which are needed for the maritime unit, the empire, the fleet, and so on. And the last concept is power projection, which is very popular with the United States for a logical reason. It means the ability to use force outside the national territory. And of course, fleet is the a primary mean for force projection. Okay, now let's look more directly at the concepts. So the main concept is sea power, which for Mahan means almost the same thing as command of the sea. So he taught a course on naval history, and this course was about wars in the modern Europe, like the Anglo-Dutch, the Anglo-French, and so on. And he thought that by teaching history he can gain some practical knowledge, and he was also inspired by his historian like Mommsen. Mommsen wrote about, for among other things, about the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. Carthage was the sea power and Rome was the land power, and in the end Rome defeated Carthage by building a, let's say, a world fleet for that age. So you can defeat a sea power if you become a sea power, right? A little. So now, in his studies, he developed these two meanings of sea power. One is direct military control, and the second is economic position. His theory also emphasized that you need to keep the fleet focused, concentrated, and this way you can blockade the enemy. So this is basically Mahan conception of sea power. You must have the strongest fleet. You must interdict the enemy circulation, movement, and ability to fight. You must win all the major battles and impose a blockade. And if you do that, you basically won the conflict. The enemy will have, in the end, we have no other option than to give up. So this is one of examples from my hands. So the most important example is about Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar, and this is basically the British Admiral Nelson Admiral ship HMS Victory. This ship still exists. It's like the oldest ship who's serving in the navy in the world, and is constantly maintained by the Royal Navy. So you can see here basically an illustration of Mahan ideas, how to win a major rivalry by a sea battle. Okay, and of course Kroll has a lot of critiques. The first critique is that the main concepts are not very well defined. For example, if you look at the war now the former war between the United States, Israel against Iran, what does it mean sea power? Iran was able to interdict the passage to Hormuz Strait. So you can say that in this case, the United States actually lacked sea power, even if the United States had a concentrated fleet, imposed a blockade, and so on. So basically, you see that the concept of sea power is ambiguous. Now, the second critique is that sea power is only an element. So we can return at Trafalgar. After the Battle of Trafalgar, the result wasn't that Napoleon was defeated. The result, as Crowley argued, was that Napoleon was actually at the head of the triumph of his conquest, the height of his power, and the Battle of Trafalgar was basically a scratch. So it wasn't that important as Mahan argues that it was. Then there are obvious great powers who are not world powers, they are continental powers like Germany or Russia. Of course, in case of Russia, we can say that it's also a world power because it's spread on several continents. But their main source of power, it is linked to ground. So not all great powers are typical classical maritime powers. So this is a problem with the theory. An even more serious critique is that Mahan cherry picks history. So he only looks at the facts which can argue in favor of his idea, and and he avoids critique. So basically, he doesn't argue in a rational manner. Uh, Another critique, which they are all related. So another critique is that he overemphasized blockade. Blockade isn't always decisive. Blockade is only decisive in combination with other factors. And the last critique is that actually, if you look at modern wars, it's not only sea power plus something. Even in cases of Japan, he argued that Crowell argued that sea power was combined with air power and land power and marines and so on. So basically, it wasn't just ships. So we spoke about Mahan and his concept of sea power. We saw some critiques. Basically, he may have a point, but his point is an exaggeration. And now let's look at his pragmatical side. So he was a supporter of what was called then American imperialism, and American imperialism meant that the United States at the end of the 19th century had several engagement and wars, like war with Spain and war against the Philippine resistance. And the United States gained the primacy and possession in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Hawaii, Philippines, and so on, and also built the Panama Canal. So you see there are contemporary echoes of Mahan's and the 19th century imperialist period even today. He was erratic, meaning he didn't have a precise project of expansion. He changed his mind often, and he was more of a symbol than a decision maker. So even when politicians used Mahan, they had their own, like Theodore Roosevelt. They had their own projects, and he was basically like the symbol of U.S. Great power, U.S. project of becoming great power. Now, his most, as Carl underlines, that his most important project was for United States to build a world fleet. So he's linked with this idea that the United States must have a very the strongest fleet. And even today, this message is important, and in a way, the quote from the beginnings is true. The prophecy of Mahan is still important in U.S. Policies, U.S. strategies. This is an example. This is a new class of United States carriers. General Ford is the first ship. The picture is, I think, from 2022, and there were also it was mobilized in the let's say war against Iran. So you can see that today United States is still investing in large capital ships, even if it's a carrier, which means it's only like a moving airstrip for airplanes. So it's not in itself, it's not the ship who's powerful, it's the airplanes who are powerful. Even so, you can by analogy say it's a capital ship, and the US fleet still relies on capital ships. So the United States Navy is still Mahanite. So you see several examples of policies besides the Caribbean in Philippines. So the United States during the war with Spain was portrayed as a liberator. Then he entered into Philippines. He transformed Philippines in colony, and in Philippines had a lot of movement of resistance, and Mahan supported that. Mahan also argued in favor of an active policy in China. Like many Americans, he saw that China has a great big population, and he wanted a slice of the Chinese market. So even in the 19th century, people dreamt about the Chinese market. So something changed, not very fast. Okay, now there are several conclusions. One is that Mahan established the concept of sea power and command of the sea. uh, he probably exaggerated the importance of concentrated fleet and of the blockade, which means there are other sea strategy which are effective and efficient. For example, to rely on submarines, to rely on missiles, to rely now on drones. He literally criticized all fleet dispersion, and he overemphasized big ships instead of smaller engines. And there is an irony about naval strategy that for centuries there was no need for a written textbook of strategy. So Mahan basically was one of the authors who started this trend of writing about naval strategy. Before that, it was more like a practice, a strategic culture. Remember, from the first video, the distinction between strategy and strategic culture, and he is a very good illustration that, for example, in case of Royal Navy, the British Navy, for centuries, he had no big textbook on strategy, he had a tradition. And the last is that Mahan is very influential today. You can say that both the US Navy and the Chinese Navy are influenced by Mahanite idea, especially this idea of to build big ships, to rule the wave and to rule the wave with big ships. Never mind if the big ships are carriers or other type of ships, there isn't this attraction for capital ships. And you see now a counter example. This is the Ukrainian class of anti-ship missiles. It is the anti-ship missile who sank the Moskva, who was the most important ship of the Russian Great Sea, Black Sea Fleet. So, if a missile can destroy a capital ship, you may wonder, in the age of drones and anti-ship missiles, how the balance of capital ships and other types of engine will look like, and whether the Mahanite idea of gathering the fleet in one place and use it to enforce the blockade, which is what Russia tried against Ukraine, is still valuable today, is still credible today. Now, there are several review questions. First of all, what is the role of Command of the Sea? So, Command of the Sea, you saw that is a military objective, but it's also related to military objective which matters because it's a link to trade. So this whole control of the sea strategy is linked with mercantilism, protectionism, and, for example, ideas which are common in the second Trump administration of today. There are these two meanings of sea power: the military and the economical. Another subject which is open to discussion is whether the concept of command of the sea is still important today, or maybe it requires further refinement and adjustment. A fourth topic of discussion is about the rivalry between the US and China, and which has an important naval dimension, and to look at some critics against the Mahan perspective. One example is that concepts are vague. Another example is that he cherry picks history, and maybe a third one is that sea power may be important, but there are also other factors which must be taken into consideration. So this is a bit of bibliography. So let's go back a bit at the arguments. We need to remember and to keep in mind that Mahan is important. Command of the sea is basically for him a condition of great power, and this idea is influential for, let's say, for the U.S. decision makers and the U.S. strategists, and his emphasis on fleet concentration of the fleet and the concentration of force and decisive manner. Here, he's in a way influenced by Germany. We spoke about Germany in the previous videos. Thank you, and see you next time. And happy holidays, Merry Easter, and so on.